Hello! We continue with this series devoted to a commentary of Plato's dialogues, and after the first three, we continue now with the Charmides, one of Plato's early dialogues. We shall start with a little introduction about this dialogue, and then we will continue with a slight analysis. I wouldn't call it in depth, but an analysis of the different parts and what is stated in each of them. So let's get rolling. So a few introductory ideas about the Charmides. First thing, this is one of the early Platonic dialogues, like all of the ones we've been talking about till now. The consideration of some critics, especially of Gregory Vlastos, is that some 10 or so of Plato's dialogues reflect his early thoughts and probably reflect with quite a high degree of accuracy the real dialogues of the historical figure of Socrates, who was Plato's teacher in his youth. One characteristic of the so-called early Platonic dialogues is that in all of them we have Socrates, the philosopher, walking around, prowling around Athens, and meeting people. Those dialogues generally have as their central point this discussion of Socrates with someone he encounters on a definitional issue, on what is X, where X is generally some sort of moral virtue. And these are sometimes called heuristic dialogues because they establish a dialectical combat, if you wish, between Socrates on the one hand and the definitioner or definitioners on the other hand. The dialogue generally goes like this. Socrates does not present a definition of his own. He presents objections, logical objections to the definitions that are furthered by the other person on the definition of what is the X. And these dialogues, after some riffraff, generally end in a sort of aporia. The definitions that have been proposed for what is the X, what is the moral virtue being explored, have all failed. They're all unsatisfactory, and the dialogue ends in Platonic despair at the incapacity of clarifying this issue. Now, the interpretation, as we've said, there is the belief that Socrates was really like that. He was a person who engaged in these dialogues, was a moral philosopher who did not necessarily push on his own agenda or interpretation of moral issues beyond the general idea that moral issues were important and that they should be the main topic of reflection of intelligent and rational creatures. The quote from the Apology, "The unexamined life is not worth living." So these would be the characteristics of the early dialogues, whether or not we believe that they do represent the authentic way of thinking and of dialoguing of the historical Socrates, or whether they just represent a stage or a view on it, or superficial view on certain topics that Plato, the philosopher, engaged in, while in other dialogues he preferred to delve deeper into aspects and present his own theories. So early Platonic, and the dating probably would make it, if it's an early Platonic one shortly written not too long after the death of Socrates, so at the very end of the 5th century, the early years of the 4th. Actually, the action that takes place in the dialogue is meant to have taken place like 40 or 50 years before that, at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, but we'll comment on that once we start the dialogue. But the framing narrative is Socrates coming back from the Battle of Potidaea, which was at the beginning, as I said, of the Peloponnesian War. So I would make a mistake if I gave you a date now, but probably in the 450s BC. So this is an early Platonic dialogue, and it follows pretty much the stereotype of the early Platonic dialogues pretty rigidly. Perhaps Socrates in the later parts of the dialogues is pushing too much on his own initiative at trying to find the definition of the word that is being explored here. But it generally fits the model of the early Platonic dialogues. What is the key word being explored here? Well, it's sophrosine. Remember, Plato's Socrates is, especially in the early dialogues, is a moral philosopher. So he is exploring clear definitions of what is the good, what is the virtuous, this sort of things that are abstract and difficult to pin down because you can find examples of abstract moral virtues, but defining the virtue in all of its cases and in all of its ways might not be that easy. Well, we must think that the Greeks also, at this period at least, lacked dictionaries because the definitional game doesn't feel that difficult. But anyway, the key word here, as we were saying, was sophrosine. What is sophrosine? It's a difficult term. One of the difficulties of Plato's dialogues is they're in Greek, and Greek is very different from our modern English. Sophrosine is generally translated as temperance. But temperance in modern English has, associations. It's an archaic word, really. You would only use it for alcohol non-consumption, like the temperance movement in the 19th and 20th century, which proposed giving up alcohol. In religious contexts, you would have the archaic meaning of a control of one's sexual urges, slightly similar to chastity, but not implying a complete renunciation of sex. For the Greeks, sophrosine included these elements, but included much more. It was a more abstract word that referred to a form of self-control, of an ability at behaving in the proper and adequate way and at controlling one's desires and behaviors to match expectations. So it would have had, therefore, a more general meaning, so more about controlling oneself and one's impulses. It would have been connected with aristocratic values of wealth, with the ideas of good breeding, of a person who has the virtue of sophrosine, shows in his behavior that, he's an aristocrat. He knows how to behave properly and what to say and what to do without necessarily being instructed. So take that into account while we discuss different definitions of sophrosine. And one frustrating thing of reading Platonic dialogues in translation is that sometimes the dialogues and the definitions given in the dialogues feel pretty much very absurd or, very careless. Part of this apparent carelessness stems, in the case of this dialogue, the Charmides, from the fact that the word sophrosine has such a wide range of meanings. Of course, another part is probably Plato's attempt at recreating what would have been the authentic Socratic dialogues in the street, which, unlike philosophical treatises, would have had a certain degree of improvisation, which includes making definitions of the top of one's head, which might not be very precise or accurate. Okay, let's move on to the plot and the characters. Basically, this dialogue has three people in it. A few more are mentioned and they appear very briefly. But basically, there are three characters in this dialogue. One of them is Socrates, who is walking around the town, middle-aged, not too old as Socrates, probably at the beginning or early in his philosophical career. In his 40s, probably. So, in his 40s. There's a young aristocratic youth, Charmides, who gives the name to this play. Actually, Charmides was a relative of Plato. I think he was an uncle. I'm not completely sure. Anyway, at the stage of this play, he is a young and sexy youth. Very, very handsome. Very, very attractive. And there's his uncle, Critias, also related to Plato, therefore. Both Charmides and Critias would come from aristocratic backgrounds, and they would have become notorious and infamous at the time that this dialogue was written, because they were they were part of the aristocrats who participated in the infamous tyranny of the 30 that took place at the end of the Peloponnesian War. After the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War, there was a coup, pro-Spartan coup in Athens, which ended the democracy and which started an oligarchic dictatorship, which was pretty bloody, also pretty short-lived, the 30 tyrants. Critias was one of them, Charmides was also one of them, and they both were killed in less than a year afterwards, I think, with the restoration of the democracy. So complicated characters. One of the reasons for Socrates' death was, or it has been speculated, was his association with this sort of unsavory, oligarchic, anti-democratic aristocrats, for many of whom he was a mentor, and therefore he was probably associated with their misdeeds and with their values. And Critias also was quite an intellectual in his time. I think he wrote poems. I'm not sure if even some plays which haven't been preserved. And those are the characters. There might be, although others have disputed this, but there might be an irony in having them in this dialogue discussing Sophrosine as these people were the exact opposite of self-restraint in a way, if you consider the historical irony of their violent aristocratic and anti-democratic feelings and their contribution to the violence of the 30 tyrants. They would be people who seemed not to have learned the Socratic lesson in this dialogue of self-restraint, of Sophrosine. In fact, there is even a slight sketching of their violence, of their implicit violent natures at the end of the dialogue, but we'll come to that later. Couple of things before we start. So, homoeroticism, self-restraint. This is a very homoerotic dialogue. And, for the Greeks, homosexuality was, up to a point, accepted. This poem, this dialogue is brimming full with it. I don't have an issue with that, even though I'm a straight heterosexual person. But there is an aspect that I do find slightly unsettling, because, a lot of the action before the dialogue starts is basically a bunch of old men ogling with clear sexual intent on a young teenager. And that's not something that I relish. Homosexuality in Greece and in Athens had this, how could I say, maybe pedagogic aspect. Homosexual pairings were very often pairings in which a younger man, a teenager, paired with an older man who acted not only as a homosexual partner, but as a mentor of sorts. So this element is very clear in the beginning of this dialogue. There's also an element which appears in other Platonic dialogues, especially in the Symposium, and which appears in popular culture at the time, which is what I would call the Socratic overturning of desire. So Socrates was famous in anecdotes for being a hideously ugly man. But in both this dialogue and in the one I mentioned in the Symposium, there's this idea, there's this irony that is being played out in the story of how this really ugly man starts a dialogue surrounded by beautiful young men who try to, and he feels attracted to the young men, but through the dialogue, at the end of it, it's the young men who have become seduced by Socrates and who are running after him. So, this seems like a comedic plot element, if you wish, but it's played out repeatedly in these dialogues, with Socrates always the model of a rational person who has passions and desires, but who always masters them rigorously with his reason. So he is an example of Sophrosine, of self-restraint. And finally, just to go on to the dialogue, I did get the impression while reading it that it felt a little bit like there was, like a basic story, and to which an insertion was made, a little bit like the Book of Job. You remember in the Book of Job, I think most biblical critics believe there was a shorter Job story, which includes the beginning and the end of the current book. So it's a very short story. Job, this good man, does everything that God wants. The devil tempts him, takes everything away from him. He stays loyal, and God rewards him again. But in the current book of Job, in the middle, you've got a big chunk, which is most of the book of Job, which includes philosophical dialogues, basically, between three characters and Job, three friends, where they discuss. Job complains about his punishment, and so on, and the others argue against him. So I get the same feeling with this dialogue. Like, you could have a very short story, which is Plato's or Charmides dialogue, if you wish, which perhaps would have been something like this. Socrates comes back, goes to the gym, meets Charmides, has a short dialogue with him in which Charmides is unable to define Sophrosine, but he becomes enchanted or seduced by the nature of the Socratic dialogue itself, and he decides to follow Socrates. But that in the middle, so that could be a framework. But here in the middle, we have two persons sustaining the dialogue. The first one is Charmides, but when a certain stage of stagnation is reached, Critias intervenes, and the meat of this dialogue is the Critian part of it, like the Critian attempt, the failed attempt as well at defining Sophrosine. So I did get that impression, but anyway, let's move on to the dialogue itself. So first part of the dialogue, let's say from 153 to 158, see, we have the framing narrative. This part is not the most philosophical, it's just an introduction, a setting of the scene of the dialogue. We could call it Charmides the Gorgeous, because it centers just around creating the situation in which Socrates encounters this gorgeous youth. So, as we say, the story begins, it begins as a narration. We don't know when this narration is supposed to be occurring, but in this narration, Socrates is talking to somebody and is describing this incident that happened perhaps shortly before or perhaps a long time ago. Socrates has just returned to Athens from the Battle of Potidaea, which is, as I said, one of the first battles in the Peloponnesian War, in which Socrates showed himself to be extremely brave, by the way. I think it was in Potidaea that he saved the life of the young Alcibiades by his bravery and sticking to his post. So Socrates has come back to Athens. He is prowling through the spaces of the city where he can find people to converse with, and he's going to a gym. And he's going to resume his custom of, having Socratic dialogues with people. He's accompanied by Chaerephon, and Chaerephon tells him that there's this really, really handsome boy, and that he should meet him. So they go to this gym. This boy is Charmides, of an aristocratic background. He's very attractive. He comes with a group of other youths, and it's clear that everybody is ogling and having their eyes set on this beautiful Charmides. Socrates himself is aroused sexually, but of course, he's the man of reason, and he wonders if, besides being beautiful in the outside, this Charmides might be beautiful in the inside. So he decides he wants to have a chat with this Charmides, and the excuse that is brought up to bring him to him is a little white lie. So Charmides has been complaining about headaches, so his uncle Critias tells Socrates, okay, we'll say that you have this remedy against headaches. And this is a white lie that Socrates starts explaining, like while he was battling in Potidaea, in that area south of ancient Thrace, he received a charm that cures headaches. He makes some side notes about medicine which are interesting there. Like he says, this charm cures the headache, but good medicine doesn't just cure one part, it cures the whole body. Not only the whole body, but the whole soul has to be cured. There's this holistic view that health is a balance in which all your parts are in good condition, and this includes the material part, your soul, and your material part, all the parts of your body. And this would continue later with Galen's theory of humors, the idea that all the illnesses that arise in humans are a result of the imbalance of the four humors that inhabit the body. Anyway, introducing this white lie and his charm that cures headaches, Socrates says that, he moves the discussion to the typical philosophical question of what is the X. In this case, what is temperance? Because this Charmides has been praised not only as beautiful, but as a very temperate by his uncle. So the debate starts, and Socrates asks Charmides the question, what is temperance? Okay, so from 158d to 162e, we have the start of the dialogue. Basically, Charmides tries to make three definitions, one after the other, and each of those definitions is refuted by Socrates. So definition number one that Charmides makes is that temperance is a sort of quietness or a sort of slowness. I think the Greek word for quietness, stillness, slowness is the same word. Okay, doesn't strike one as the best possible definition one could think of temperance, but it does map, I think, into the idea of temperance as something connected with self-restraint. I think this is probably what is probably attempted to express in the quietness, slowness idea. Like, don't be rash, don't, when you are under sophrosune, you do things without any rashness, thinking carefully about them, slowly, meditatively. Now, a lot of the refutations that sometimes Socrates makes in his dialogues do feel like nitpicking of a definition, but then again, the definitions that are presented to him are sometimes not the best. So his objection to defining temperance as a sort of slowness, quietness, is basically to say that, okay, let's assume axiomatically that temperance is a good thing. Let's say that temperance is admirable. So if we assume that temperance is always good and is always admirable, and we say that temperance is a sort of quietness or slowness, we have the problem that there are things that are not slow, things that are done rather quickly, and they're not necessarily intemperate. Yeah? So things that are quick. So, for example, we value a quick learner rather than a slow learner, or a quick thinker rather than a slow thinker, and in a lot of other things. He gives some examples. So we value being able to do things quickly and not slowly, and we don't consider it intemperate to do these things quickly. To be able to understand the text quickly as opposed to taking a long time in understanding it is not intemperate. So therefore, temperance cannot be a quietness or a slowness. Okay, Charmides continues in the same line. So he says, okay, let's define it differently. Let's say temperance is a sort of modesty. And again, this definition, like the previous one, seems to connect with this idea of self-restraint, of self-control, of not being too showy. So modesty, not pretending to be more than you are. And here Socrates again makes a rebuttal, and he says, okay, if temperance were modesty, you have the issue, and he makes a quote to authority, to the classics, basically Homer. And he says, Homer has a quote in the Iliad or the Odyssey where he says that modesty is not appropriate for a poor man. It doesn't become a person in need to be modest. So the problem with defining temperance as modesty is that before we accepted axiomatically, if you wish, that temperance has to be always good and always admirable, if we say that temperance is modesty, do we agree? Then we have a contradiction with Homer, because Homer tells us modesty is not always appropriate. That would mean that temperance is not always appropriate. But if temperance is a good, it should always be appropriate. So that's another problem for this definition. Charmides moves on to the third and last of his definitions, which is that temperance is minding one's business. This feels a very weird sort of definition, a very poor one, but clearly much poorer than the other ones. I think it probably still reflects this idea of temperance as being something about the self, about self-control, self-management, self-administration. So in a way it is managing of one's self. But of the three, this is clearly, or it appears to be, without any further explanation to specify it, it appears to be the weakest. And Socrates makes it quite clear in the dialogue. He says, this seems plainly wrong. Unless it's some sort of a riddle, how could temperance be just minding one's own business? That sounds pretty absurd. Okay, so here begins the Critian Interlude. So Critias, during sections 163 to 175a, is basically going to intervene The motive, the excuse for intervening, and it's made explicit in the dialogue, is that this last definition of minding your own business was clearly not Charmides' definition of sophrosine, it was Critias's, and Charmides was quoting his uncle, and his uncle is therefore brought into the battle. And remember, his uncle is an adult with quite an intellectual background, so he is going to make his defense of his definition of knowing oneself, of minding one's business. Critias is very interesting. His intervention is very different in many aspects from that of Charmides. He will be more contentious, more aggressive, probably because, he's a figure, an intellectual figure with status and an aristocrat, and he is very sensitive to losing face. And so he has a more aggressive attitude towards Socrates, and he's also more sophistically and intellectually sophisticated. So even though he sometimes makes definitions of temperance that are also going to be found lacking, he shows a greater degree of rhetorical ability at trying to make a beautiful and convincing argument, even if it's not a rationally convincing one. So the Critian Interlude starts with Critias defending his definition. He doesn't explicitly recognize that the definition is his, but he more or less implicitly accepts that that is the case. So he starts with the definition, minding one's business, and he does a little bit of playing with words. He says, making is not the same thing as doing, because Socrates' immediate refutation is that, when you do things for others, are you being intemperate? If the definition of temperance is minding your own business, when you mind other people's businesses, like when you make goods for other people, are you being intemperate? So, that feels automatically and obviously ridiculous. And then Critias starts by saying, no, well, you should distinguish between making and doing. So making things for others, if they are good things, that's nothing. That has nothing to do with being temperate or being intemperate. One thing is making things for others. Another thing is meddling into other people's affairs. And the second part is the meaning that is to be implied. But very, very early on, Critias moves on to a second definition, or you could say it's an extension or a clarification of this minding one's business. And he says, temperance is doing good things. It doesn't feel very convincing, is it? For me, it is very abstract. I mean, temperance is doing good things, and any virtue is about doing good things. But anyway, this is Critias's definition. Socrates answers back. He doesn't find it satisfactory, and he says that if Socrates is doing good things, you have the issue that, sometimes people do things and do not know if what they've done is good or wrong, like the doctor. You come to the doctor makes he studies how you are and gives you a prescription and makes a diagnosis, but the doctor is, he might be wrong. And he only knows afterwards if what he did was good or what he did was bad. So the problem with this is that a doctor, for example, might be temperate because he does good things, he cures people, but he won't know it because, he might not know if the patient really got better or not. So he would be a case of someone who is being temperate, but who doesn't know that he is being temperate. And again, one of the axioms that is accepted about temperance is that the person who is temperate, and temperance is good, and the person who is temperate knows that he is temperate. So Critias would accept that it's necessary for a person who is temperate to know that he is temperate. So it must be a person who does good things and knows that he does good things. So, as an extension, if you wish, again, Critias would say that temperance is the art of knowing thyself. And, this connects with the typical view, this was one of the maxims of the Delphic oracle, Gnothi Sauton, know yourself, was inscribed at the entrance of the oracle at Delphi. And as you can see also in this, I think, Roman mosaic, although it's the sentence is in Greek, it would be temet noscete ipsum or temet nosce in Latin. Critias's definitions are becoming more and more general by the by. So, first, minding one's business, which clearly seems to be a bit far away from temperance. Then, doing good things, and now knowing yourself. And here again, we have a little bit of a play of words, because this knowing yourself becomes knowing what can be known. And the dialogue here takes a completely different line, if you wish. So it will stop talking about what we would recognize, or what a Greek person might recognize as temperance, and it ends up into a discussion about a possible meta theory of knowledge, science of science. So after Critias has described temperance as knowing thyself, Socrates says, okay, so what does this science of the self, this knowing thyself, produce? And the idea is, all sciences have an object, and they produce something. So the science of medicine produces health, or the science of mathematics produces knowledge of mathematical objects, or the science of shipbuilding produces ships. Here we must take into account, we're using the term science for what the Greeks would probably call episteme. That is a sort of knowledge that is true and applicable, not science in our modern sense. But more of a skill or an art. So what does this science of the self produce? So Critias basically says this science of the self, which is temperance, is a sort of a multiple type of science. It's a science of oneself, of self-knowledge, eaitou, but it is also a science of itself, aute eaites, and of the other sciences. So Critias is really upping the ante with temperance. He says temperance is about the science of knowing oneself, of knowing what science is, of being able to determine when a certain discourse or a certain person has real knowledge or lacks real knowledge. And it's also a science of sciences, and of the absence of science. So it would be a sort of technique or science for knowing when somebody possesses science or does not possess science at all. It would be a discipline of what one knows and does not know, and of what others know and what others do not know. So temperance is transformed into this super discipline that allows one to know what one knows and what one does not know, and what others know and what others do not know. So the Critian Interlude is long-lasting. It's the meat of this dialogue, you could say. And again, as I said, it ends up not being much of a dialogue about temperance and more about implicitly philosophy, because I would wager that moral philosophy is what would better fit the definition that is being given here of a sort of science that knows the limits of all other sciences, or that determines the presence or absence of true knowledge in people. Or you could say this is the Socratic endeavor. Basically what Socrates does in his dialogues is question people to check if they know what they say they know. Anyway, so we continue this discussion of this hypothetical science of what one knows and does not know, and of what others know and do not know, and of what a science, and of when a science is a science, and so on. So Socrates finds this interesting, and he makes a long discussion about it. So he says, basically there are two things we can discuss. Let's assume that temperance is this sort of science of science, and let's discuss two important aspects about it. First of all, is such a project possible at all? Can we really have a science of science? Can we really have some sort of skill that automatically tells you if a person that is talking about any issue has some rigorous, real knowledge about issues or not? And if there exists such a science that can be applied to oneself as well, so that you really know that in these areas you have absolute certain knowledge, and in these areas you don't. So first of all, is such a science possible? And the second question to debate would be, if it were possible, what benefits would it generate? Now, its possibility is not a given necessarily. There are problems about it. One of the objections that Socrates presents is that a science of science, it feels a bit like a misanabism. We had already presented the problematics of a scientific discipline that seems to have no clear object of inquiry. Like, and here Socrates makes an example with the eyes. Like the eyes, the science of seeing is the science of using the eyes for perceiving things that are outside. It would not be possible to have a science of seeing, a science of a science of seeing, which is not focused on exterior objects, but on, you know, some sort of abstract possibility of sight and so on. And another objection is that if you try to use a sort of meta-science of science to analyze things, sometimes you get illogical answers for properties that apply to other things and to itself. So if something, well, this is a bit convoluted. I would probably have to reread the dialogue to be able to explain you this better. But the idea here is, if something has certain properties that apply to itself and to other things, sometimes this seems to generate contradictions or things that are a bit illogical. Because this science of science is a science, as we said, by the definition of itself and of science outside of itself. And this would seem to generate some contradictions. But Socrates says, okay, let's ignore these problems. Let's assume that, yes, it is possible to have this temperance, which is a science of science. Let's say it is possible. But we have another problem, well, another further objection, apart from the objection that we've just mentioned. How can one know what people know and don't know with it? Because remember, it's a science of science, so its specific object is science itself, but not a specific science, not specific material. So if this science of science knows that people know or don't know, but at the same time it's not a specific science, how can it judge knowledge about the other sciences? The example is a fake doctor. So imagine you have a fake doctor. He doesn't possess the science of medicine, but he might possess the science, the skill of charlatanery. So if you had this temperance, this science of science, and you listened to this fake doctor, you don't know about medicine, so you wouldn't be able, with only the science of science, to deduce that this person is a fake doctor. You would be able to use the science of science to detect that there is some scientific knowledge he lacks. But again, he does have one sort of knowledge, this rhetorical skill of bluffing and lying effectively. So with the science of science, you would only detect that he has one skill, whatever that skill is. You wouldn't be able to really say the skill is at charlatanery instead of the skill is at medicine, because for knowing that the skill that he does not possess is not medicine, you would need to know medicine yourself and not just this sort of meta-science, this science of science. So this temperance would seem a little bit useless from this perspective. It won't allow us. The idea is, if it worked well, if this science of science allowed you to know when a person really knows about his field of expertise, then you would be able to choose the best people for the best jobs. But as we have presented it as a purely abstract science of science that has no knowledge of specific sciences, it would be completely useless at giving posts to people in the administration. This connects us with the second problem of this definition of temperance as a science of science. What benefit would it generate? And here the axiom is temperance. We defined it previously as a good. So it can only be beneficial if we somehow prove that temperance as a science of science does not generate any benefits. Then this would be a contradictory definition of temperance. So let's ignore these objections to the possibility of a science of science, of temperance as a science of science, and check if this temperance as a science of science can generate benefits. So even if we grant that scientific temperance is attainable and allows us to check that people have knowledge or do not have the knowledge they think they have, it wouldn't have the power to make us fare well and be happy. So here the Socratic implicit assumption is that only knowledge that can make us happy is true knowledge, is a true good. That is, the true benefit is being able to fare well and be happy. Can temperance do this? So only an application of temperance to check what is good and evil can procure happiness. So a science of good and evil would be the science that we need for being happy and for experiencing a real benefit. But if temperance is a science of science, it's definitely not a science of good and evil. So this definition of temperance is not useful for us. This definition of temperance is a definition that does not conclude that temperance is always a benefit, is always a good. So temperance, defined in this way, is not beneficial necessarily. It's something other than beneficial. So here we have reached the aporia and the end game of the dialogue, if you wish. Temperance is assumed to be a good. Our argument has led us to assume that it is not necessarily a good. That is, this science of science is not necessarily always a good. So Charmides recognizes his lack of knowledge. The dialogue ends with that. Critias implicitly also recognizes his lack of knowledge. And, the dialogue ends with this tables turn, which I mentioned in the introduction. So Charmides and Critias, instead of being angry at having been led to this situation in which they clearly cannot define what sophrosine is, have nevertheless experienced some sort of a benefit. At least they have recognized the positivity, the need to engage in this sort of Socratic dialogues to gauge the depths of what they know and what they do not know, and perhaps to use this as a springboard for a deeper exploration of what sophrosine really might be. And, the situation ends with Charmides recognizing that he doesn't know about sophrosine and that he needs to be charmed by Socrates, and Critias assents. Both conspire in the end and plot to force Socrates to yield to their demand. And the dialogue ends with that. They are going to force Socrates to continue to indulge in these dialogues with him in the future. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's an irony in this because both Charmides and Critias would use force in a very negative societal context in Athenian history. So they clearly are examples of peoples who did not profit and did not acquire sophrosine as they should have. But anyway, very interesting, very curious dialogue by Plato. And we will leave it at this.